Okay, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's American Community Media Zoom news briefing. I am Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor for ACOM. My colleague Sunisa Sorachi, Health Editor at ACOM, put together this briefing, but she has been dealing with a bout of laryngitis and cannot moderate today, so therefore I'm taking it. The release of more than 3.5 million documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has created a media frenzy, with reporters combing through the files to find high-profile names. The survivors who were exploited by Epstein and his cohorts have largely been relegated to the sidelines. Survivors' rights were not recognized as the Justice Department failed to redact many of their names in the tranche of released documents. Indeed, at a Senate committee hearing on February 11, U.S. Attorney Pam Bondi failed to apologize to the victims sitting in the room with her. The Epstein case has failed to shed light on the larger issue of sex trafficking. Hope for Justice notes that more than 1 million people are trafficked each year. The majority are young women and girls, but fewer than 1% of sex trafficking cases are ever prosecuted. Today, we will hear from speakers on the ground in Houston and Texas and their attempts Houston, Texas, and their attempts to get justice for survivors. We will also hear from a woman who was trafficked at age 17 and spent 3 years trying to break free. And we will hear why survivors need to be at the front of the conversations and reporting regarding the Epstein files. We invite reporters to post their questions in the chat. We will take questions from reporters immediately after each speaker presents, and we will send video and follow-up material after today's briefing. We ask speakers to speak slowly for simultaneous interpreters in Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. Our panelists are Dr. Michele Goodwin, Professor of Constitutional Law and Global Health Policy at Georgetown University, Jacqueline Aluoto, co-founder and president of No Trafficking Zone, Courtney Litvak, sex trafficking survivor and former member of the U.S. Advisory Council to Combat Human Trafficking. Carmen McDonald, Executive Director of the Survivor Justice Center. So we begin with Dr. Michele Goodwin, who will discuss the sidelining of victims in the Epstein story and the importance of taking a survivor-based approach. Dr. Goodwin will also discuss the barriers to successful criminal convictions in sex trafficking cases. In December, Dr. Goodwin hosted a very enlightening podcast with Epstein survivor Jess Michaels. I will drop that link in the chat. Go ahead, Dr. Goodwin. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this very important briefing. The first thing that I would like to express is that for all of the Epstein survivors, the victims, and all of those beyond Epstein that are contained in the files and all of those that are not in the files, there is a connection between power, violence, and the silencing of people who have been sexually assaulted. This has been a long-standing issue, and in part that may be why there has been such a long road towards justice, because there have been unjust systems that have been in place even before now. Just for historical context, in the United States, marital rape was legal even while this nation began with the land of the free, home of the brave, with concepts of liberty, privacy, and freedom. Married women were not afforded that. Courts relied on treatises that said that women had no independent identity apart from their husbands. For centuries leading up until just recent years, husbands could kidnap, rape women that they were married to, even if they were separated, even if divorce papers had been filed. So long as divorces had not been granted yet, courts deferred to the husband and to waivers in American law that made it permissible for men to do this, or at least made it such that they could not be criminally charged and punished for engaging in such heinous crimes. We see much of this today. That's the criminal side. The civil side is that in civil law, it was the same. Spousal immunity, parental immunity meant that men could rape their wives, rape their daughters, beat their daughters, and yet not be found liable in court with civil judgment because courts came to think of the marital home as places that needed harmony. But what they focused on was only male harmony. In fact, in cases that I've written about where daughters have attempted to sue their fathers after cases of sexual assault and violence, courts over the years in the United States ruled that it would be disruptive to the harmony of the household if girls were allowed to prevail. The idea being that sexual assault and rape against daughters was not unharmonious to the household. What was unharmonious to American courts was girls being able to get justice. So, what does this mean in this context? What we've had is a judge saying that these are files that should be made open and available to the public. What's been made open and available is only a fraction of the Epstein files. Horrifically, what's been revealed in these files are the names of individuals who have been raped and sexually assaulted. Even their images have been revealed. This is absolutely shocking and inconsistent with what would be the rule of law and inconsistent with what we would expect in terms of dignity, integrity with regard to law. And what we've seen is the covering and the protection of individuals who are found in the files. Now, around the world, there have been punishments that we see. There are people who are resigning from seats that they hold, and some of that we've seen in the United States, but it's been very, very slow. There's been a failure to take into account the US president and his mention a number of times in the Epstein files, and with allegations that he too had sexually assaulted someone who was a young girl. We don't know for sure. Those allegations are there and allegations in the files. There are numerous others who are located in the files with allegations that they have committed sexual violence and assault against the women and the young girls, women now, but girls, at the time in which these matters took place. Look, it's a tragedy. It is a horror. And one of the gravest aspects of this horror is that in real time, while there are survivors who've come forward, we have a seat of American government, two seats. We have the executive and also Congress failing to take the action that is necessary in order for justice to be fully pursued. It's not that there aren't courageous lawmakers who, and it shouldn't take courage to do your job. There are lawmakers who are articulating in this space, who are demanding more, and they should continue to. Now, in terms of your question, what does it take in order to get justice? Well, that part is complicated too in many ways in the United States because people who have been victimized as children, as young people, then experience a statute of limitations in most states, which then limit the amount of time that they have in order to pursue claims against individuals that have harmed them. Some states have looked into this and have attempted to change their laws such that the statutes of limitations would, in fact, either go away or be broader such that an individual could reasonably have the time that is necessary to think through what has happened to them and then pursue what they believe is the right course of action. Of course, it's very difficult if you've been sexually assaulted at the age of 6, 7, 8, or 15 or 16, and then heading off to work, to college, the military, to think about, well, when do you seek justice for yourself? Of course, that's very hard. And if you have statutes of limitations that place it such that you have only a few years after the age of majority to bring a case, well, that makes it, of course, very difficult, almost impossible for someone to actually cogitate through what they've experienced and then do the transformative work to move to the next stage. So, what I am hoping for is that out of this time that we are in, that we not only address what is urgently important and in front of us, the people who survived Epstein and many of the people who are listed as abusers in those files. But hopefully, it also opens the door for deeper, broader, honest conversations in our society that connect power, political power to violence, but that also provides pathways forward, both state-wise and also federally, for individuals to be able to receive justice, to be able to pursue that which would allow them to be able to flourish into their adulthood and move away from the stigmatization and the shaming that has been a part of the legacy of individuals coming forward to articulate about the abuse that they have experienced in their lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodwin. Let me ask a question and then we'll take questions from the chat. So many cases against Epstein have been summarily dismissed for lack of evidence. This is similar to the scenario in instances of hate crimes. For example, in 2016, Katie Johnson filed a civil lawsuit against both Epstein and Trump, but the case was summarily dismissed for lack of evidence. What kinds of evidence are prosecutors looking for? And would you say there is a reluctance to proceed if a high-profile name is involved?
I'll take the second part of this first, which is that yes, clearly there is a reluctance to proceed if it's a high-named individual that is involved. We see that as a result of the Epstein conviction. Limited time in jail, the ability to be able to leave jail and have a life, be able to continue to live his life, and the casting of these poor girls as being prostitutes, as sex workers. So he gets a very light sentence, a slap on the wrist, able to use his plane, able to go to his home. Jail is like an overnight camp, basically, for him. And I think that that is a reflection of the power that he had. Economic power translates to political power in that instance. And so these are dire kinds of cases. And to your point about, well, what kind of evidence are they looking for? Well, this is also very difficult too, because if you're a child and you've been sexually assaulted, if you're a woman, if you're a man and you've been sexually assaulted, unless it is that you've then filed a police report, and it's worth noting that there were police reports that were filed in the case that did lead to Jeffrey Epstein's first criminal prosecution and conviction. But was a police report filed? Well, what 6-year-old is filing a police report? 10-year-old, 14-year-old filing a police report? Was there a rape kit that was done? Well, if you're not filing the police report and you're not going to the emergency room, who's going to take you to the emergency room? I mean, imagine the 14-year-old who had been, or 15-year-old who had been working at a very prestigious place like a Mar-a-Lago and then recruited from there over to Jeffrey Epstein's place doing these massages and then sexually assaulted. There is no blueprint for a child in terms of what it is that they need to do to collect the kind of evidence that is going to be necessary for police and prosecutors later. Here is a problem. Part of the problem is that prosecutors are expecting them to do their cases for them, that they are expecting that young people will have amassed the kinds of evidence, will have had the kinds of conversations, all of these things that they believe give them a stronger foothold in order to bring a case. Now, it does matter. Due process matters, absolutely. And prosecutors are held to a standard where they should pursue, and law enforcement too, making sure that rights, including those who've been criminally accused, are protected. But I think that there's a big gap between making sure, which is required under law, that people who are accused of crimes have their due process protected, have their rights protected. There's a gap between that and then doing the work that is necessary when someone comes forward and says, I was assaulted, I was harmed. There is a different socialization that we need in terms of respecting individuals when they do come forward and looking for the kind of evidence that typically might be overlooked but is important, such as did someone tell a friend, a guardian, a relative of what happened to them? Police and prosecutors can do the work of saying, well, yes, do we have evidence? And yes, we can, that you were coming in and out of that particular place. I mean, even looking at their age, let us not forget that in these states, including in Florida, there are statutory rape laws which actually go to the benefit of these young people. One of the surprising things about the Epstein convictions that took place is that under state law, states consider this automatically to be rape when someone has been sexually assaulted and happens to be under the age of majority. That person doesn't have to do cartwheels to explain what happened, and consent is not something that lawfully can be provided.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. We need to move forward to another speakers, and then we'll just ask the questions after. Okay. There's already several questions in the chat. We now move to Carmen McDonald, who will provide an on-the-ground perspective from LA County, one of the highest child exploitation counties in the country. Mrs. McDonald will also focus on the vulnerability of immigrant women, and that's one of the questions in the chat, who face many barriers to reporting the crimes against them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am Carmen McDonald, the Executive Director of the Survivor Justice Center. We are a legal services organization that provides free legal services to low-income survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in Los Angeles County. Trafficking has always been present in our community. While the Epstein case is certainly one of folks that are rich and powerful, there are many regular people who are traffickers and that are trafficked. When a trafficker has power and social capital, they could use the legal system against the survivor and people who are being trafficked. For example, we'll see where they might make a police report against a survivor for drug use that was coerced or other crimes that they may have committed as a result of the trafficking. There's always the fear of arrest, and that leads to the coercion surrounding folks that are trafficked. If a survivor is discarded, but then reaches back out to the person who trafficked them, they may file a restraining order against them. If a survivor speaks out, we see cases where they can get sued for defamation. These all have chilling effects on survivors fleeing or trying to find safety. There are lots of ways that a person's reputation is harmed and that voices are silenced. Just now, as we're seeing photos of victims being released, people are worried about their confidentiality and their privacy. Yeah. When images are posted, nude photos of a survivor often are posted online. It can involve a site-by-site quest for a survivor to find which sources have the photo and have to deal with different policies around how to get pictures taken down. Non-immigrant survivors have barriers when reporting to law enforcement. Lots of survivors are often hesitant to participate in the criminal justice system as they may have the prior arrests I mentioned related to their trafficking. They may have a prostitution conviction or a substance abuse conviction. These criminal issues hinder further healing for survivors. It can prevent things like folks getting jobs, housing, or even keeping custody of their own children. It can lead to future exploitation of the survivor who has limited resources. It can lead them to be afraid that people won't believe them and discredit them because of their criminal past. Proving the coercion and describing the situation to law enforcement can be incredibly difficult. The nuances between how a perpetrator and a survivor are connected may not even be fully understood by law enforcement. So the relationship could be mischaracterized. If officers are in a hurry or they don't understand how the survivor is connected to the suspect, They may not ask the right questions, and the crime could be mischaracterized as something maybe just a simple battery or just a singular instance of a rape. And so immigrant survivors have even more intense barriers. If English is not your first language, you may struggle more. It might take a higher level of interpretation to understand the subtleties. There may not be access to the right interpreter. It can be hard sometimes, especially in a city like Los Angeles, to find the specific dialect that a person may speak. And the immigration status is, cannot be understated enough. Having someone's immigration status used against them is a concern. There are lawful remedies for survivors of trafficking, but now our clients are calling us and telling us they're afraid to report crimes against them. They're afraid to deal with law enforcement. They're afraid to be on the street at all. They're afraid to leave their homes. And we don't blame them. It's important to never blame a survivor and the choices they make. But it is a real issue that many survivors are unaware of their rights, even when they're undocumented, and there are rights and remedies. But the increased immigration enforcement issues are a significant barrier that our clients are facing. There's a lot of myths surrounding human trafficking. A lot of people aren't even aware of what they're enduring is technically human trafficking. Sometimes our clients come to us, and it's not until we interview them and they disclose what they've been through that they're able to explain that what they've experienced is actually trafficking. Someone might consent to a certain arrangement initially and then reach a point where they're like, no, I want this to stop. But then the coercion keeps them in the situation, often with a higher level of coercion and pressure. And so people who are coerced to continue past a point of wanting to stop, they are also survivors of trafficking. A survivor isn't always physically forced to stay with their trafficker, and they may choose not to leave. This could be interpreted as consent. Now, it's absolutely correct. Under 18, consent is not an issue with the law. But when we're talking about someone who's an adult, the decision not to leave is more complicated than whether someone's being physically held against their will. Some folks lack basic necessities to get out, such as transportation or having a place to live. Some are afraid for their safety or the safety of their families. Sometimes the families are threatened. And some are so manipulated to the point that they may not even recognize that they're a trafficking survivor. And often things like folks' identity documents are kept from them. And so it's really important to carefully assess a survivor's issues and what they are saying, and make sure that we're believing survivors and not blaming them through their journeys.
Okay, let's take a question from Pamela and Chang. Pamela, please identify your media organization and ask your question.
Thank you so much, and good morning, and thank you for addressing the immigrant issue. But I did have a question regarding immigrants, undocumented folks, especially in the Epstein situation. So my question was, do we know whether any of the victims, Epstein's victims, were immigrants or undocumented? And if so, how would their immigration status have affected their ability to come forward? And also, are there any concrete protections for this particular situation for such cases? Because as we know right now, immigration is a big deal and everybody is scared. So are there any groups that are protecting possible victims?
Thank you, Pamela.
So I can't speak to the immigration status of the Epstein survivors, but there are protections for immigrants who are trafficked. There is something called a T visa that if you have experienced trafficking and meet certain other qualifications, there is a potential visa that you can file. It's very important to talk to an attorney that is aware of immigration remedies. There are many organizations that provide legal services to survivors of trafficking. I can post some of those into the chat, but so most important would be to make sure you're talking to an attorney who understands immigration laws are changing monthly, daily, weekly, by the minute, and you want to make sure that you're talking to someone that knows the most current law that and the most recent protections for survivors.
Okay, Carmen, the New York Times in October ran an expose of the trafficked girls at LA's Figueroa Street. Have you worked with many of the young women who are out there?
Our organization mostly helps adult survivors. There are remedies for survivors that are age 12 and older who can actually petition, for example, for a restraining order without having parental consent. But our organization partners with folks that do the work for the CSEC community, but that's not someone that isn't our direct client population.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Looking at the chat. There's a couple questions for Dr. Goodwin. Dr. Goodwin, are you there? You turned off your camera. Okay.
I am.
Let me take this opportunity to take one of these questions. Henrietta Burrows, can you ask your question of Dr. Goodwin?
Yes, thanks, Pilar. Dr. Goodwin, how do you explain the positions of Pam Bondi and the female lawyer who worked with the Obama administration who recently resigned from a top law firm? The women who seem to protect Epstein and the sexual perpetrators, and who also seem to defend the current status quo concerning the victimization of women. Do you think these women are just protecting their careers? Are they being one of the boys? Or are they part of the Stockholm syndrome where the victim begins to side with the perpetrators?
Thank you very much for that question. And it's an excellent question. And it raises real concerns because when individuals who hold power and influence act in ways that are complicit, it's deeply confusing. And it may, in fact, lead people to discredit and not believe victims and survivors who are coming forward when there are women who are closing the door or certainly not advancing the concerns of individuals who have been harmed. And we see that tragedy unfolding now. And it's important that we pay attention to it. And that is to say that in any organization, within any institution, there may be people who have something in common with the people who have been victimized and harmed, and those people cause further additional harm by neglecting their duties and responsibilities or explicitly continuing on to further harm those individuals by not taking their claims seriously. And you've raised this with regard to the Attorney General Pam Bondi, who has been, it seems, very neglectful and negligent. And not just seems, it is there in violation of what is a judicial order to release these files. And it also means that with the way in which she conducted herself very recently in hearings when there were survivors that were in the room, not doing what would be common decency and respect for them by recognizing that, but instead calling people who have been alleged to have harmed these survivors victims. I believe that you talked about the president, for example, as having been victimized through this entire process. I completely disagree with that. And I do think that we need more attention to be much more clear that just because someone happens to be of the affinity group, that does not mean that they are doing their due diligence or their job to protect those individuals. And it can happen based on race. It can happen based on sex, and it can happen based on sexual identity as well. We see it across all categories.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Mrs. McDonald. We're now going to move to Mrs. Jacqueline Aluoto in Houston, Texas, who will discuss no trafficking zones successes in creating legislation and legal protection for children and young women who are vulnerable to exploitation. She will also discuss the challenges NTC has faced in getting justice for survivors. Houston is the #1 city in the US for sex trafficking. Please go ahead.
Thank you for having me. First, I want to address and thank the prior speakers who talked about retaliation, criminality, what really happens with victims, and touched on such amazing information that is really critical. First of all, human trafficking is a $245 billion industry. That alone should tell how many people are profiting and participating off of this illicit business. When we first founded No Trafficking Zone, we founded it because it was overwhelming. Such a crime for $245 billion. How do you break that down? And so we break down human trafficking into markets. Some of our present speakers have spoken about it, but different markets of human trafficking is trafficking on a blade or a track, trafficking like Epstein did, where he trafficked girls through the modeling industry. The Jeffrey Epstein network was very big. He did international trafficking, which was modeling visas, but then he also did domestic minor sex trafficking, where he went to the poorest communities, would get girls to recruit each other and do peer-on-peer exploitation in schools in Florida, where over 82 cases did go to the police in Florida and state that they were being trafficked through their school. One of the ways that No Trafficking Zone has been successful in creating laws was we understood the school pipeline and market with domestic minor sex trafficking in America. In Texas, on any given day, over 79,000 youth are trafficked. And through a study, 55% of survivor leaders said that they were first groomed, lured, recruited, and trafficked and exploited with an intersection to their schools, meaning it could be a former student, a teacher, a coach, an introduction to a gaming, a chat room. So when we were doing recoveries with law enforcement and working with law enforcement, people were asking questions. But when you do long-term advocacy, such as building cases and care, you're years in advocating with someone and you find out and learn, what exactly, how were you trafficked? And so for the school market in Texas, that was something very big. So we created the first no trafficking school zone law with Senator Larry Taylor, SB 1831, making human trafficking a first-degree felony, 25 to 99 years, with the intersection of the internet. And this was so prevalent and important because the internet is another major factor of how trafficking and exploitation happens in this nation. And we knew that the kids that were being trafficked in schools were being talked to and groomed on social media. Traffickers and pimps and networks were sending Ubers and Lyfts to pick them up. So if you broke that school zone, it was 25 to 99 years. And that also included any school functions, not just any school functions, but proms. Really, there was so much that had to do with that, school hours. And for us, we wanted a deterrent. Traditionally, with human trafficking, it has been a high profit, low risk crime where predators like Jeffrey Epstein, and then you have your street pimps, your organized pimps, your domestic gangs, your international networks, your corporate CEO traffickers, they're making millions upon millions of dollars. But in places like Texas and states across the nation, they're getting deferred, probation, a slap on the wrist. And so there's no deterrent to stop this crime. We want to make it with no trafficking zones that it's a first-degree felony. We then extended no trafficking zones in Texas to add to all college universities. We saw during the COVID epidemic, especially kids in the foster care system who had aged out but had gotten state assistance, that while the campus is closed down, kids in foster care that were aging out and homeless youth, they didn't have a home to go back to. They couldn't go to school to get food for the cafeteria. The intersection of poverty and exploitation is so high, especially also in America. And so those kids were being trafficked on those campuses. So we also then extended the first degree felony 25 to 99 years, no trafficking zones for universities and college campuses. We then did it for foster care. In America, over 60% of domestic minor sex trafficking will be connected to the welfare and the foster care system. Again, survival trafficking and exploitation is something that really needs to be talked about when we're talking about the most vulnerable communities. And then finally, this year, we had extended the whole state of Texas is now a first degree felony to human traffic anyone. It's now 25 to 99 years, which we're hoping will deter networks as big as Jeffrey Epstein's and as low as your pimps. These are things that are very important when you talk about criminality and what's happening with victims. When victims come forward. Sorry, I hear an echo. I think someone's thing is on. But when victims come forward, what happens is they often be charged for crimes. The intersection of drug trafficking and aggravated robberies and violent crimes that juveniles and trafficking victims are forced to commit under their traffickers, because it's a better way for their traffickers to control them, because once you do have a record, it's so much harder to go back into the world. Second, victims, a lot of them don't identify. They don't identify as trafficking victims. They're so trauma bonded to their traffickers, even though they're very afraid of them. That shame of being exploited, where they have felt like they have done the most horrific things with their traffickers have convinced them that only they can understand them. Because the goal of a trafficker and a predator is, if I can completely dismantle your identity and turn your identity into what you want, I can control you. And so when we're talking about why the Epstein system happened, when you're talking about $245 billion, that is such a large amount. That's not just a national problem. That is a global problem where you have a lot of corruption, a lot of people's hands are in it, but it's also an inept and broken system. And so we need tangible solutions to combat trafficking. And there are. We see laws like ours and laws like others who are doing it. We also have the no trafficking zone in Houston, the Game Over initiative throughout sports stadiums, where we track ads for sex stores and sex trafficking with that market. And so understanding how human trafficking works, how commercial sexual exploitation works, sextortion, how our kids are being targeted online through gaming, what does sextortion look like? Once we understand the magnitude of these crimes, we can then implement systems. Federally, these laws need to be federal. It is ridiculous that victims for 5 decades, Jeffrey Epstein was tied to 5 presidential administrators. Like, I just want people to understand that. That's 5 administrations. Why, when all of these victims come out in Florida alone, over 82 for that school system, why wasn't there more done? And I think the bigger question of what people are afraid of is victims did speak out. But when victims did speak out, not only were they retaliated against, but they saw that they're powerful predators. Nothing happened to them. And so if justice is going to just be a myth, then we cannot expect to ask people to speak up. What we have to do is, while we're asking them to speak up as victim advocacy agencies, as law enforcement, we have to be able to offer them the protection to, while they're speaking up, that we can also help them when they're being sued civilly and criminally by the actual predators that they're speaking up against. And I really want to touch on all of those things, because when we talk about this and everybody's seeing it, it's such an intricate crime. But when you break it down into the markets and how it's happening, we need to implement tangible solutions. And then and only then are we going to be able to end child sex trafficking and human trafficking in America.
Jacqueline, is it your experience that young women are not taken seriously enough by law enforcement and other actors in this situation? I mean, it seems, of course, when the person is a high-profile person, I understand because there's power involved. But in general, it seems that women are not taken seriously, are not listened to.
I think, but women are not taken seriously. And I think it was Carmen or the doctor who said it before that. When you press charges against a violent sex crime and trafficking, what's the most alarming about these cases is that there was tangible evidence. Prosecutors and agents had tangible evidence. They had victims handing over cell phones and laptops, a digital imprint. There's so many ways that you can track trafficking, cash apps, financial statements. Um, I think that not only are these women not taken seriously, but I think in the past, agencies haven't worked together to understand that these girls, they weren't just sex trafficked. These men are using their money, and you saw it with Epstein, laundering their money through shell companies, through modeling agencies, through real corporations. And so I think in the past, when a lot of these people went to local law enforcement and federal agents, they weren't educated. They were not educated enough on the crime. They didn't understand it. I know right now we work along with HIDTA, which is a high drug trafficking area. They're a local, state, and federal task force because many of our cases, we couldn't get human trafficking charges. So we were saying, let's get drug trafficking charges. But then once we all started working together, they understood these financial crimes, these drug trafficking, it's all stems from human trafficking. And so I think when victims come out, I don't even know if it's not just that they're taken seriously. I think that our prosecutors need to change the way they are prosecuting cases for sex crimes. It's 2026. There is absolutely enough ways to get evidence and to get convictions for very bad actors that are doing it on this level and magnitude. But the system needs to change, and law enforcement and federal agencies need to work together, but understand not re-traumatizing victims. And I'll give you an example. We had a case where the victims bonded with a certain agency, but then they made the victims talk to a different agency because that agency didn't want to work with the other agency. That is not trauma informed at all. Why would you make a victim who's coming forward with any kind of evidence have to continue to re-traumatize themselves and re-exploit themselves in talking about their sex crimes with these sex traffickers? And then what happens to these victims after they do it? How much they're spiraling, how they're thinking about, I just told on someone that I've seen kill people or that it has threatened me. And so I think that there's many elements that go into why law enforcement and people need to listen to victims a lot more.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move on to our last speaker, and that is Courtney Litvak. She's a sex trafficking survivor who was trafficked at age 17 and held captive for 3 years. She will discuss her work with No Trafficking Zones and the U.S. Advisory Council to Combat Human Trafficking. She currently also serves in an advisory capacity with the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Courtney.
Hi, Pilar. Thank you very much for having me on for this important conversation, but also I want to second what Jacqueline and the other incredible speakers said. All of this comes back down to why are we in anti-trafficking in the first place? It's supposed to be for the victims and survivors. So I'm very grateful I get to come and add the perspective as a human trafficking and sex trafficking victim who was a victim of minor domestic sex trafficking beginning at age 17 years old, and I was trafficked for almost 3 years across the country, but it began at my very own high school. So my name is Courtney Litvak. I'm not only a survivor of sex trafficking, but I'm also the director of survivor initiatives for the No Trafficking Zone with Jacqueline. And I also serve as a consultant for the Department of Homeland Security Blue Campaign. And I formerly served under both the President Trump and President Biden administration on the U.S. Advisory Council to combat human trafficking. But where did this begin? And this is one of the things as well. I am so honored to know and work and walk alongside and advocate for and be advocated for by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell survivors. these are our survivor brothers and sisters. So it's not only female victims, but a victim can be anyone. But also, one of the things that I relate and see so much parallels to is trafficking beginning in schools. As Jacqueline said, 55% reported just in the state of Texas alone, first being approached by a recruiter and human trafficked from their school. And this is K through 12. This was happening in the Jeffrey Epstein case to young victims who were still in elementary school, but primarily middle school age victims as well, and even high school. And this happened to me first as a junior in high school. Junior year is already a very difficult, very tedious year where you are looking to pursue college for most students, but also faced with your PSATs and getting prepared for your future. But how can a victim or survivor be focused at all on their education when they are in what's called survival mode? Now, this is what began to take place in my own testimony. I was first a whistleblower, and that's another really important topic that's been discussed on this call is retaliation that whistleblowers, but also the lies of traffickers and predators that are reaffirmed when law enforcement drops the ball, when a victim does report. And that's exactly what I did. I attempted to report the crimes that were happening to not only myself, but other female minor victims at the time. And under the age of 18, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion to obtain a human trafficking charge. And then it becomes much more difficult for law enforcement after the age of 18. And so while I was a minor, my parents grew so concerned for me once I was taken and I was drugged and assaulted after and during a school event, which was a homecoming dance, by a very abusive older gentleman who was in the military, but I was surrounded by my swim mates. I was on the swim team, and when I was supposed to be at a sleepover that night, sadly, this perpetrator had taken my phone and took me across town and drugged and assaulted me for the very first time. Now, many other things put victims, it doesn't just have to be a traumatic sexual assault, but that is sometimes some of the predecessors of what leads up to making an individual where anybody can be susceptible to trafficking, but there's a lot of root causes and things that lead to make anybody a target of human traffickers. And not only did this assault put a target on my back, but when I had to leave swim practice early in the morning and go to the principal's office and report these crimes that had been shared with me, I was the first female to be notified of a blackmail and child sexual abuse material CSAM ring that was taking place not only at my high school, Cinco Ranch, but taking place throughout Katy ISD. Now, the school immediately was more concerned with liability versus accountability, and they covered up these crimes and cared more about protecting their varsity athletes, protecting their school reputation, and all of the tax dollars that so many parents, including my own, my family moved to Houston in 91 and moved to Katy, Texas in 1996. So they were well-renowned community members, very well-known and loved by everybody in Katy, Texas, but the school was more concerned about their prominence in Katy, Texas, than they were about what they were reporting happened to their daughter and having to receive calls from the school because they are mandated reporters. So as this federal investigation began to unfold at my high school, I was treated like the criminal. And this is something that further confirmed to me that my parents, adults, the school counselors, the principal, the superintendent, and law enforcement only sought to silence and hurt me for speaking out and coming forward. That was how I was approached by my very first sex traffickers at my high school, as they saw a gap. There's many gaps that students fall through. It doesn't always mean schools are malicious in working with human traffickers, but they're negligent. And so when schools are supposed to be taking attendance, I was approached by my very first trafficker during school hours, who would then connect me with former graduated students who were convicted felons for human trafficking. And this is how this can happen hidden in plain sight, as well as how it happened in the Jeffrey Epstein case when he was trafficking young girls from their schools. Is, like Jacqueline said, peer-on-peer exploitation is so rampant in schools, whether or not the student is malicious or not, they are being given what's called a finder's fee to turn over as many victims as possible, female and male, to a trafficker who is a part of a more sinister, larger organized crime network. And all of my human traffickers were also drug traffickers. And it all began with traffickers sex trafficking me at my school beginning my junior year of high school as a minor. And then sadly, my parents and law enforcement had so many other difficulties in continuing to pursue any case against me. And my traffickers, they studied the laws. Traffickers are very well versed in how to evade detection and evade law enforcement and continue to make their victims in fear, absolute fear, that law enforcement are only seeking to arrest, criminalize, and abuse, and even assault them themselves. So there are very great law enforcement who are taking these crimes seriously and are more trauma informed. But sadly, during my experience and what my family experienced and countless other survivors and victims, including those of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, are faced with, sadly, those lies seeming to be affirmed when law enforcement does not follow up with evidence they're given. My parents turned over burner phones, cell phones, and there was evidence of recruiting, grooming, and trafficking. But then days later, after I was involuntarily taken out of my school and sent to a wilderness program that was also very harmful, a part of the troubled teen industry, I was then brought back for my senior year, and my traffickers took me. Days after turning 18, they physically took me from my home, and then I was trafficked across the state, and including other states such as California and others that I cannot fully share at this time as there is ongoing cases. But at the same time, it's not just about going after traffickers because of how scary it is for victims to name their traffickers. And after being failed so many steps along the way in my initial case, in reporting to the school, reporting to adults, reporting to my parents, sadly, I went further and further down this hole of the traffickers and recruiters approaching me, befriending me, which is the first step of the grooming process, and making me believe that they had my back and that they would be there for me and protect me because they said they saw nobody else could. And in fact, their nefarious purposes and ulterior motives would be revealed after almost 3 years being taken and sold into different sex trafficking networks across the United States who were involved in organized crime. And every single one of them were also involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and money laundering. And all of these things are so important when we're talking about this. But to remember, put yourself in the victim's shoes. And sadly, all those gaps I experienced, yes, that was very alarming and eye-opening, and we're still seeing those gaps and victims falling through them, especially with the release of the files recently. But I'm so thankful for organizations such as the No Trafficking Zone who come and walk alongside victims and meet them where they are at. There is no such thing as a perfect victim. And so many victims do not self-identify, especially with a crime as intricate as human trafficking. And there are so many forms of human trafficking that take place: familial, gang trafficking, and also corporate CEO trafficking. And my trafficking began with gang and street trafficking at my high school, peer-on-peer exploitation, but led all the way up across the country to corporate CEO traffickers who were laundering mine and the other girls' money through corporate America businesses hidden in plain sight. And I think there's so much of that we are seeing uncovered with the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell case. But sadly, there are so many Jeffrey Epsteins and Ghislaine Maxwells who have yet to be discovered and are also still operating with what seems like impunity. And that's one of the reasons we want to set these precedents. And I'm so thankful to the No Trafficking Zone for not just walking with myself, but also walking with other victims and survivors, trying to attempt justice. And that not only are 1% of victims able to exit the life of human trafficking, but it's even less of a tenth of a percentage who are able to even see a possibility of getting a successful prosecution and then a conviction for human trafficking. And that's why we see a lot of other conviction rates that are higher for other crimes, such as drug trafficking, because human trafficking charges, no matter the evidence you present, no matter how many years of pleading with law enforcement and investigators and prosecutors, this is the evidence. And there's more than one victim. So you have to corroborate these crimes and substantiate the evidence. But while you're being trafficked, it's such a non-linear experience just as well the healing journey and the fight for justice is nonlinear, you start to realize these are the gaps that we have to fill in order for victims and survivors, not just to be able to present, that they are out of the life and that they want justice, but to give them a feasible path forward and laws in place that support victims and don't just protect predators, as we've seen.
Thank you. Thank you, Courtney, for your sobering testimony and your work in this area. I'm going to ask this question of you and then go to the other panelists as well, because we're running out of time. So what is your advice to reporters, to all of us covering the Epstein story, for how do we center survivors? How do we cover this story right?
Yes, thank you, Pilar. I think one of the keys is we need to defund the sex trade. So what does that look like? We need to follow the money trail. And I really encourage all the reporters on this call, but just the general public, to move past the awareness piece, which is so important. The prevention pillar is so important. But as so many already have fallen victim and are still currently being trafficked by this crime, I think we really need to incentivize all of our audiences who are becoming now aware and educated on the issue to look at the money trail. How do these entities that are supporting, profiting, and participating in human trafficking in any way, and their co-conspirators and any of the people who help cover up their trail, we need to look at all the ways they make money, all the ways that the public, whether they own a public corporation where we are supporting them or it's subscription based, we need to all take away our support, which can look monetary, that can look multiple different ways. But I think we need to do everything we can that individuals can do is to defund the sex trade by defunding and holding all these perpetrators accountable, at least with how we support them financially.
Thank you so much. Jacqueline, what's your take on that? What do we do as reporters?
I think as reporters, you have to really be brave, because what's happening is these powers of influence. We see it on a local level here in Harris County. If we are going up against traffickers or men who have raped women that are in law enforcement, or they're political leaders, or they're law enforcement leaders, or they're these big philanthropists or elected officials or senators, and we're standing with the victims, we can't get media to cover it. We can't get media to cover it because that power of influence even controls the media. So we need for journalists to be just as brave as survivors. What we're asking survivors to do, and then the advocates to stand with them, we all need to be doing the same thing. So we need for our media and our journalists to be just as brave, because if we are gonna dismantle organized crime and this heinous crime and this network that works with it, then the media has to start doing factual things. It's sad that it's taken 30 years for Jeffrey Epstein and for the media to start covering it the way it should. It was thousands of victims. It should never get to this point. It has to get to the point where we're standing with the first victim, that everybody comes out, and it doesn't matter who it is, whether they're the most powerful person in the world that's a trafficker, or they're a very poor person. A predator is a predator, and they have to be held accountable. And one of the only ways they're going to be held accountable is when there's real journalism that is fighting for us, because that's when you only see with whistleblowers. We're only getting justice when the media gets involved. If the media doesn't get involved, no one's going to stand with you, because you're not only just going up against one powerful perpetrator, you're going up against a corrupt system where many people's hands are a part of that corruption. So it's their job to protect that corruption. So that's what I ask for journalists, to be just as brave as everybody on the front lines.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you, Carmen.
We would ask that the survivor not be blamed for what they did or didn't do, for whether they called law enforcement or didn't call law enforcement, and blame the perpetrators, and to remove barriers for survivors. We do post conviction relief. We work and educate the community, and so be there when survivors need them and listen to them.
Dr. Goodwin, last word. Dr. Goodwin.
Now, I would say that what we need going forward are clearer legal paths for justice for people who have survived sexual assault and violence. And the point being made earlier that it's not just women and girls, but it can be anybody. And we've seen these patterns beyond the Epstein files. What the Epstein files allow us is to shine a light on this and let that light carry forward to understand the harms that have been inflicted upon people for a very long time and even concurrently right now. And I really want to underscore the point that we just heard, which is that oftentimes trafficking in individuals also ties to trafficking in guns, trafficking in weapons, trafficking in drugs, and so much more. So this is a broader problem, a broader political problem, a broader problem for the rule of law, but I think we can get around it and we can solve it. And one of the first things to do is to respect the voices and to respect the experiences and the insights that come from people who've survived sexual and also physical violence.
Thank you to all of you for your insight and your testimony. Reporters, we will see you next Friday for a briefing on vaccines featuring Dr. Richard Becerra, CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Have a great weekend. Thank you all. Bye.